Okay, so recording has now started. So I am going to welcome you all to our September at Home, which is exploring the fragrance of dress and textiles. And we have three really lovely papers to look forward to. We're going to start with Caroline, then we're going to have Kim, and then we're going to have Hilary. And as is normally the case, we're going to have a paper and then questions, paper, then questions, paper, then questions. And then if anyone has some stamina at the end, we can have a general discussion. I'll introduce each speaker and their title as we go through. It's a very informal space, so please feel that you can also add comments in the chat as well as questions, but we're always eager to answer your questions if we can, and it is lovely to see so many of you joining us today. So what I'm going to do in my capacity as host is, like I said, welcome you to our fragrance special and also introduce you to our first speaker, who is Caroline Vaughn-Kett. She is a fragrance industry professional living and working in Sussex, UK. After working in marketing for niche British brand Miller Harris, Caroline realised her passion was in scent development. And she completed studies at highly regarded schools for Perfumery. I'm going to pronounce this really badly, so just bear with me. The Grasse Institut of Perfumery and the ISIPCA, there we go, of Parfum, Cosmétique. I'm not going to try and do the rest of the French. It is on the Eventbrite page. She graduated around 7 years ago, and she's worked as a fragrance evaluator at Quintessence Fragrance, a British heritage fragrance house with specialisms in air care, personal care, and fine fragrance. And today she is presenting a paper called Sense and Sensibility, an insider's view into modern perfumery. And we are really fortunate to have her with us because she is doing this above and beyond her normal work responsibilities. And this is the first time she's sort of entered a dress and textile space. So we're really grateful to you, Caroline. So I'm now going to hand the screen over to you and allow you to share your slides. And yeah, away with the paper.
Hi everybody, good morning, good afternoon. So yeah, as Veronica said, I am an industry professional. So I'm not a academic in any sort of capacity, but I just want to give you a bit of information about the fragrance industry, because it's actually quite a closed off industry that people don't necessarily know that much about. It's quite mysterious and it's still very new to a lot of people. So first of all, thought we'd just go through a really basic sense of how do we smell. Now, this was research that was actually done in 2004 in the Nobel Medical Prize, and they were discovering the odorant receptors. So the sort of passage of how we smell something, you know, see a rose, bend down to smell it, nice little rose molecules go up your nose, they go into your olfactory epithelium, where there's a sort of lock and key type system which will allow each molecule to unlock a certain receptor. It sends a signal through to your olfactory bulb, and that's actually linked to your temporal lobe and your limbic system, which is where all your memories are stored. So that's why sometimes when you smell something, it triggers a really kind of straightforward visceral response. You can love it, you hate it, reminds you of grandma, it reminds you of boarding school. It's very kind of linked to how your feelings are. It's not so much a fight or flight sort of response, but it's very much linked to how you feel. And the next part is sort of just trying to figure out who works in a fragrance house. So we said that I'm an industry professional. Lots of people say, oh, does that mean that you work, you make fragrance for Prada? And you say, oh, no, actually, no, I work behind the scenes in a slightly more different capacity. All of these brands you see on the right, these are brands that produce fragrance. They put things out into the market. You see them in Boots, you see them in Selfridges, you see them, you know, Bloomingdale's, but you don't actually see the people that create behind the scenes. And those people that create behind the scenes, they don't produce any sort of finished good. My company produces fragrance oil, which is then put into these products. So within the fragrance company, you have, of course, the perfumer. These are often the stars of the show. They're the noses. They're the people that build the formula, that build the recipe for the fragrance. They use accords and bases. They use natural and synthetic components, and they create the nuances and the facets that you find in fragrance. Then you have someone like myself. I'm a fragrance evaluator. I work guiding the perfumer, and my job is to translate the brief that comes from an account manager. And I smell things, I test them, I work them for compliance, and I'm generally sort of the steering hand behind the creative sort of genius. Then you have the account management team. Obviously, they're the ones that contact the brand, like Tom Ford, and they get the brief back in and they say, oh, how do you think that we should interpret a tobacco for winter, and this is then my job to create that. Or the marketing team, they create a visual identity to fragrance, because obviously a fragrance alone cannot sell itself. You have to write a story, you have to make it look right, you have to think who your audience is going to be. Obviously there's other people, there's compounders, there's research and development, there's regulatory, which we're very, very governed by now, and analytical perfumers who have a whole new other way of looking at things. So for the purpose of this very short paper, I just wanted to go through kind of what is a perfume and what do you mean when you say perfume. As you can see on the screen, you've kind of got the different concentrations. These are 5 of the main concentrations. There's actually a couple more, but they're a little bit more niche. So for this purpose, we're talking about fine fragrance. We're talking about fragrance that you used to scent yourself. We're not talking about anything, you know, household or technical. So the concentrations would be sort of between 1 and 3%. You'd have an eau fraîche, that's a very watery splash. You're not expecting it to last very long. An eau de cologne has a slightly higher concentration of 2 to 4%. This is often applied to something like broken skin, so if you've been shaving. An eau de toilette, a slightly less concentrated version. It's not going to last you all day, but it's going to be things that are very light and floral and citrusy. Eau de parfum, this is where most of your fragrance sits in the retail market, 15 to 20% concentration. And the parfum, or even further, you get the extrait de parfum, they will be between 20 and 30%, or between 30 and 40%. The remainder of the liquid that you see in the bottle is either going to be alcohol, or it's going to be a carrier oil if you're in a culture that doesn't use alcohol. Or recently we've been discovering that a lot more brands putting out water-based perfumes, which again, they fit with the no alcohol rules, and also they are lighter and they're a lot less greasy, but they come with problems of their own. Within the fragrance that you see, or that you smell even, there are natural components. Now they come from plants, flowers, barks, roots, fruits, and those are using 4 main extraction methods to give you an essential oil and an absolute. You have synthetics, which are generated in a lab by chemical synthesis. And the recipe that you're using to make fragrance can be as few as 10 ingredients or as many as 150 to 200. I think we've been working on a fragrance at my work where the formula is about 200 components long. And every single one of those brings its own different facet and feeling to the fragrance. And you can't just strip it out to make it short because it becomes less complex. It's like painting in black and white versus painting in color. So now on to the history part, which is what everyone here is much more kind of attuned to. History of fragrance before the 19th century. Perfume was worn as a pomander, or it was used inside jewelry, and it was seen, or it was an aqueous blend that you would kind of spray on yourself or even drink. And they were sort of natural essential oils, sometimes water, sometimes alcohol based. And it was seen just as much as a health supplement as it was a ritual of beautification. The image you can see on the left is Elizabeth of Hungary, and she is sort of credited with bringing the first commercial fragrance to Western Europe. And she was Queen of Hungary, and she had this concoction that was rosemary, alcohol, and a few other citrus oils. And she actually drank and bathed in this fragrance, and it was credited with her living to about 75, which in 1370 was shocking. Everyone thought that she was immortal because of the way that she was kind of consuming this fragrance. And this actually became a precursor to fragrances that were sold all over Europe. Jean-Marie Farina and the brand Mullins took this sort of idea and they made the 4711 Colonische Wasser. And that was publicized in the sort of late 18th century, and people kind of thought it was an aqua mirabalis, a water that would kind of make you live forever. So through this sort of this lifelong kind of lifeblood idea, the fragrance industry took a different turn in about the 16th century, when the town of Grasse, which is popular for its leather tanneries, moved through to another sort of industry. So the idea of tanning leather obviously is that you use urine or ammonia, and the scent that was coming off the town of Grasse was absolutely abhorrent. Everything smelled terrible, or the leather that they were producing smelled terrible, and they had this idea that maybe to scent the leather goods would be to make them more popular, make them more palatable to the ladies and gentlemen of the day. And Catherine de Medici, she used to wear fragrance gloves, which she'd sent with a pomade or an oil. And you can see on the image on the right, this is actually the first sort of parfumeur, is Habit de Parfumeur, and he's walking the streets of Grasse, but he's got all of the fragrance components on his body, and then he's selling leather goods as well. So he's trying to tempt people with this sort of scented idea. And through the ages, obviously, fragrance was more accepted by different courts and different kingdoms. Louis XIV was famously known for having a fragrance for every day of the year, 365 different fragrances, which he would lavish upon gifts upon his chosen mistresses. And this actually didn't cease into the Napoleonic years. And Napoleon I was recorded to have ordered more than 160 bottles of eau de cologne in the first quarter of 1806 alone. So everyone was obsessed. It was about status, and it was about making yourself smell as sweet as you possibly could. Moving through into the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, it brought new methods of chemical synthesis. People were experimenting in their laboratories, and they were discovering materials that they'd never discovered before, using powers that they'd never had before. It lowered prices of raw materials, and it brought new materials to be synthesized that did appear in nature, but the more synthetic versions of them were available to be used at a lower price, a larger amount, and it moved perfumery from more of a cottage industry to the masses. And you can see on the left the image of the Hublot Fougère Royale. This was launched in 1882, and that was using for the first time synthetic coumarin, which is naturally found in a tonka bean, which was synthesized by William Parkin in 1868, and gives this really powdery and creamy nuance to the fragrance. So the Fougère fragrance actually became a family after this, and it's just a literal translation of the word fern, and it's an accord of coumarin, lavender, and vanilla, or sometimes a little bit of patchouli as well. And this tends to be a more masculine fragrance. You can see in the center Jicky. This was Guerlain's blockbuster fragrance in 1889, taking the first use of chemical vanillin, again found naturally in vanilla, but used here in a much larger dosage and made the fragrance much more accessible for people. Another sort of thing that would be worth mentioning here is the use of bases and accords. Now, bases are mini fragrance formulas which people built out of these synthetic materials that they could put into other fragrances. So something like a cassis that you wouldn't necessarily take from nature, you wouldn't extract from the berry, but you'd create a cassis base. And that base is used to create the nuance in the fragrance. And it's adding another 10 or 15 raw materials into the formula, but you can use it on its own as a raw material. And that's why we mention here in 1905, L'aromatique Coty, and they were the first, Coty was the first fragrance house to use these bases, and it just enhanced that level of complexity and originality in fragrance. So as I've kind of shown already, the slight marketing of the way that fragrance was offered to the masses, it created this demand, and then the mass manufacture of the 19th century also brought kind of with it meeting that demand. So you could produce many, many more bottles than you were before. And into the 20th century, I just wanted to give a slight sort of case study, I would suppose, about how the marketing revolution changed fragrance landscape. And this case study is sort of Francois Coty and his brand. He was the first fragrance company to offer fragrances at different price points, different sizes, and different levels of design to meet different incomes. So it was no longer the gift of, the higher classes, the upper echelons of society to be scented. You could buy L'Origine in a big flacon, or you could buy a very small amount in the pharmacy or the chemist. It was about trying to popularize it and democratize fragrance. Coty was also the first to realize that to sell a fragrance, you need to have a story bigger than just this is what it smells like and this is how nice it is. He combined his skill with that of René Lalique, and they produced the first ever bottle, box, label combination together so that you could have something that was marketizable and also that looked beautiful on your bedside table or your dressing table. You would be kind of showing off your status in the way that your kind of bottles were presented. And in probably the first example ever of guerrilla marketing, a story that I really enjoy, Coty went to Le Grand Magasin du Louvre, and this was a big store, obviously, that had just opened and was very prestigious. And he went to the sales managers and presented them his fragrance La Rose Jacqueminot. And he said, I would love to sell this here. And they laughed him out. They said, this is stupid. We don't know who you are. You know, we've never sold anything here before. How do you expect to sell anything? And as he was leaving, he walked back through the beauty hall and he just let a bottle fall from his hand onto the floor, and it smashed. And it was scenting the whole beauty hall. And he was swarmed by ladies trying to buy this fragrance. And after that, he had to sell it in the shop, and they had to carry his line. And so it was kind of his way of going about things the other way. And he was sort of a disruptor in the world of fragrance. And so his stock was completely sold in minutes. So Coty is still one of the largest fragrance brands to date, but they're no longer making their things under their own name. They license other brands. They have more than 75 other brands, which they are licensing, and they produce millions of fragrance bottles a year. And the final thing, just to touch upon, it's a very broad subject that I'd love to talk about a lot more. It's about the fragrance landscape in the 20th century. So moving beyond the sort of 1950s, 60s, it's into the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. And to do that, they had to be revolutionized the way that fragrance was used for women and for men eventually. And it was about completing a look, making sure that you are to be seen to be à la mode. And Coco Chanel was the first, actually, in the 1920s to suggest that to complete a look, you needed to add a fragrance. It wasn't just about smelling nice for yourself. It was about the whole personality that you were trying to emulate. And with that, advertisements and marketing came much more important with the way that the fragrance bottle looked and the way that the fragrance was kind of shown to be seen. So as we saw with Coty and Lalique, they designed bottles to be seen, and through the 20th century, really, the bottle design became almost as important as the scent itself. So you could spot it on a drugstore shelf, or you could spot it in a department store, and you could see that that's with the status, and bringing that back to your own home was a sort of mini status symbol. And as sexuality really became less taboo, and how shock factor became much more of a marketing tool, you can see that advertisements sort of changed in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. And you can see Belle de Opium. These three adverts actually on the left were three adverts which were banned for obscene or suggestive content. Yves Saint Laurent's done it twice, unfortunately. So they were banned for Belle de Opium for suggesting that their model was taking drugs. Oh Lola for Marc Jacobs was for sexualization of a child, even though the model in the picture was 18. It was a very linked to a sort of Lolita vibe, and it was banned by the Advertising Standards Agency in the UK. And Opium, the famous advert of Sophie Dahl writhing in pleasure, she was banned for obscenity and nudity, which you kind of see the same levels of nudity in a man, such as David Ganvey in a Dolce & Gabbana advert, but we won't go there. So from that sort of level of taboo and sexuality, fragrance has actually taken a massive shift again, and it's about finding the gender fluidity of the 21st century. You can see that brands now want to be more inclusive, but also at the same time exclusive. It's a very strange sort of planet to be walking. You've still got Dolce & Gabbana in the bottom left. They're still as sexy as they ever were. They will always have a naked man, a naked woman. They will always be pushing this sort of on their main range. But then you have a much more fluid roles in niche brands such as Byredo or Boy Smells. These fragrances aren't actually aimed at anyone in particular. In fact, they're aimed at everyone. Everyone is included in these sorts of ranges. And at the top, you can see Girls Can Do Anything and Libre from Yves Saint Laurent. These are fragrances that have traditionally masculine notes, but are marketed towards women. So the landscape is changing really dramatically, and it's changing every few years. We have these massive trends that come through, and it's just about where you want to position yourself in the fragrance world and about how you think you can do that. So without the materials that we've discovered throughout history, I don't think any of these fragrances here would exist today. And that's everything.
Thank you, Caroline. That was fascinating. I'm just trying to take it all in. Wow. So what we're going to do now is whilst I'm rounding off your paper is do put questions. Some questions have been coming through anyway as we've been talking, but do continue to put questions in the chat. As I said, that was really fascinating. You got a lot into a short time, but not.
I'm so sorry. I
No,
rattled through really fast.
It was perfectly paced and really well delivered and really well distilled. I think our only regret is that we couldn't give you more time, because I think we'd happily have listened on. I was like, well, don't end now. We're only just getting started. It's a totally new perspective on an aspect of both historic and contemporary textiles and dress, and it's an area of industry that we haven't covered before, which is why we're so keen to have this session. So thank you for both the technical information and also some of that context as well, and the lovely anecdotes that come through. I love the idea of just smashing a bottle of perfume in a department store and being completely mobbed. It's fantastic. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Anna, who is our question master, and she will start going through some of the questions that have come through in the chat. And like I said, if anyone hasn't put a question in yet and is wondering whether they should, please do go ahead. We're always keen to hear from you.
Okay, so to kick off, Veronica's asking, what's the role of France in this whole perfume story? Would you say that it was leading the development? Do you think that the French language and the kind of cultural status of France is what drove that? Or is it just really practical?
It's some of both, I would say. For Europe, for Western Europe, I would say that France was the leading pinnacle. A lot of the fragrance, sort of the mid 15th, 16th, 17th century fragrance came through Italy and through the trade routes that we saw there. But again, simultaneously in other regions and other parts of the world, there were fragrance kind of landscapes developing. I just think probably my understanding is much more geared towards Western Europe and that sort of thing, because that's how I was educated. But I think through China and Eastern Asia, there's a lot more fragrance sort of story as well that's yet to be discovered from my side anyway.
Absolutely, a decolonized approach could certainly be applied, couldn't it? So there are lots of parallels between the synthetic scent and the synthetic dye industry, which is really fascinating. I mean, would you say that perfuming today is kind of reliant more on the natural stuff? I don't know, I can't even think of the words for it, but extracted from flowers, or the stuff that's produced in chemical organizations?
Depends what you're trying to buy and what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to achieve a lower cost fragrance that's suitable for the masses, you're probably going to have slightly lower cost ingredients, which are probably going to be coming from a more mass produced. If you're trying to produce a niche fragrance that only comes out once every 6 months and is very much geared towards that's their marketing tactic, then you will have naturals of high grade and high quality. But again, that comes with its own absolutely impossible sort of geopolitical and weather fluctuations. You can't always get the same raw materials year on year. So that's another sort of area of fragrance which is really interesting, to have that natural backup, the synthetic backup to the naturals. You can't always rely on one.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? And what about, this is a question from me, what about the language of smells? Are the descriptive words always linked to taste? I mean, do your clients ever struggle with naming the smells they want? Is it up to you to interpret the dreams?
Yes, language is probably the number one thing that people find hard with fragrance. So the first thing that I learned when I went to study fragrances in the first couple of weeks, and we were sat down and we were taught the whole different language that comes with fragrance, and trying to explain that to someone who wants to create a fragrance or create a brand, you have to really educate them. And so that's part of the role of the kind of evaluator account management team, is to kind of pull out from people what they mean by sweet. Do they mean sweet sticky? Do they mean sweet cozy? Do they mean sweet like fruit? You have to kind of dig around the point for quite a long time until you really get that.
So lots of people have commented on the amazing artwork and the advertisements. I mean, clearly a lot of money and design development time has been put into these. Is that because perfume was so expensive at the time, or how does it map on to, what am I trying to say? Basically, people are loving the artwork and the advertisements. I'm going to move on from that.
I think with the artwork and the advertisements, I think there is money. There was money going into it. There were backers, and there were the houses that you see with these advertisements time and time again. You see Guerlain, Houbigant, Coty, they had the money behind them. The smaller, maybe more cottage industries, sort of small town sort of perfumery and drugstores, they wouldn't have had this multi, million campaigns behind them. And that's how you see it today. You see a lot more of these big fashion house brands with their advertisements than you do necessarily with a niche strategy, who wouldn't go for that sort of big print ad or big billboard or TV ad. They're not looking for those sort of levels of sales, but they are looking for a different sort of consumer.
And of course, fragrance is so important to the big fashion houses today. I mean, this is precisely how Burberry is going to be creating its astonishing profits, isn't it, over the next year? It's all going to be through fragrance and cosmetics. So it's a big deal. The idea of agender has appealed to lots of people here in the audience. Kay's made the point that canoe was marketed to men and women in the US back in the 70s. It's not a new phenomenon.
No. But just like fashion trends, you can't stop things coming back for cycles. And so probably the first marketed fragrance for men and women was probably back the 60s, 70s. And now, the people that were buying that then are not the people who are buying it now. And so people want to keep recycling and not reinventing, but just pushing a little bit further on the boundaries.
I mean, trying to develop Veronica asked this, or comments on this, trying to develop a scent for everyone is just a mind-blowing idea, because who is everyone?
Exactly. You have to pick your middle of the bell curve and think that that's who you're going to create for. But lots of people come to my company specifically and they have a very set idea of who they want to be marketing to, and I like that. That's much more comfortable as a brief than saying, hang on, we want to make something that we can sell to everyone and sell everywhere and sell at all different prices.
There's a big old celebrity tie-in, isn't there, going on? Do you think that's phasing out now, or do you think it's still rolling? Are we still in the Kardashian era, do you think?
That's really interesting as well. I think we are still well set within the celebrity area. However, it's a lot more common for a celebrity to create their own perfume or their own cosmetic brand than they necessarily are to be seen to be tied to these bigger brands. I mean, heritage fashion houses will always have these incredibly glamorous and incredibly meaningful connections with people. But you see now, actually, Kim Kardashian's a really great example. She's created the KKW beauty line, which was one of the best-selling fragrances, sold out everywhere in 2021, 2022. So the influencer is now much more powerful than necessarily the actor or the actress.
And probably we ought to be wrapping up the questions, but a last question for you, Caroline. Do you wear fragrance?
No, I do not. That's my guilty secret. I do not wear fragrance because, just like anybody, I like to switch off from work.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. There are lots of comments in the chat saying what an amazing and informative talk that was. Thank you very much indeed for giving it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much, Carol. I'm really, really grateful. Really, really enjoyed it. And yes, as Anna said, there's comments in the chat. There's also a lovely carryover in the conversation around the visual and material culture of perfume that will come through in Kim's paper, which is up next, and also sort of drill down a bit further into with Hilary's paper. But I think you've laid a really lovely foundation for today's discussions, and also this idea of not taking your work home with you by not wearing fragrance. I also wondered it might impede your sense of smell if you're wearing your own fragrance whilst you're testing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't wear it to work for sure.
Definitely. Okay, so thank you so much, Caroline. We are now going to move over to Kimberly Wahl, who is, as you will be familiar to many of you, but I'm going to introduce her formally. So Dr. Kimberly Wahl is an associate professor in the School of Fashion, Toronto Metropolitan University, Canada. She's interested in the intersections between fashion, art and design, history theory in relation to feminism, the body and social change. Her past publications, as well as funded research projects, have included the dress cultures of aestheticism, as well as fashion and power in the context of the women's movement and suffrage in the late Victorian period. And her current research examines the gaps between material and visual forms of knowledge and how visual culture communicates, creates, and or contains embodied experiences of fashion in dress, in both historical and contemporary settings. And her paper today is entitled Fashioning the Perfumed Female Body, 1880 to 1915. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Kim, and ask you to share your slides when you're ready.
Thank you, Veronica.
I
It's
know
been
this is
a bit
always a
rusty.
tense thing. Don't worry,
Can
this
you
is always
hear
when
me?
I'm most tense. We can hear you. We can
Hear
hear
me?
you. Fine.
Okay. All right.
And yeah, just needs to go to full screen. Perfect. All good.
All right. Fantastic. All right. I have to make note of the time. Oh, okay. I can't see the time. That's bizarre. I don't have my phone with me. I can't see it on my screen. That's hilarious. Somebody just shout when I'm over time, because I'm sure I will start rambling.
Will do. You're fine there. It's 36
Yes,
minutes
please warn
past the
me.
hour.
Please warn me. I mean, to be honest, whenever I start talking about fragrance, I start to get really excited, and because I'm very obsessive about it, and then I just talk and talk and talk. But actually today I want to ask other people questions, and I want to hear from other people. So if possible, I'm actually going to keep this really short. When I was putting together my presentation, I realized that I just had so many images, too many images, that I became overwhelmed. So my PowerPoint is actually very sparse because I didn't know what to put in, and there's just too much to be said. So I'm going to keep it really general and just talk about some of the sort of things I've been thinking about, and hopefully that will engender conversation, because I really think, I find when I'm teaching my students that a lot of them don't have the opportunity to talk about fragrance, and they want to talk about it. Like it's a topic that's of interest to a lot of people. Okay, so how do I move on? Okay, next. Can everybody see that? Okay. So what got me kind of thinking about this? I mean, how do I put this? Okay, so I in the travels, in my travels looking for fashion plates, in this particular situation, I was looking for some fashion plates to actually use for teaching, and I wanted to be able to just reproduce them and not have to worry about. So I actually purchased a fashion plate, an original fashion plate, which obviously extracted from its original journal. And I was examining it, and I noticed down in the bottom right-hand corner, I noticed that it actually mentions Guerlain, which of course is one of the historic fashion houses, as was mentioned. I've always been kind of very interested in the history of Guerlain, and I have several books on Guerlain. And so, but it was the first time I really noticed that there had been mention of a fashion house in the context of a fashion plate. And I hadn't really noticed that before. And that kind of got me thinking about the fact that, in all my travels through, and mainly it's limited to British fashion journals, which many of the fashion plates are of course copied from French fashion plates in this period. But in my many travels across the periodical literature, both for fashion and also when I was doing work on the suffrage movement, there aren't that many perfume ads in the 19th century. They tend to be like, you can find mention of fragrances, in catalogs, and you can find smaller ads, but the way that perfume advertising now is so much a part of identity, and we're meant to identify with the advertisements, and it really is front and center. The advertising and the representation of perfume in the Victorian period is veiled. It's, even though the beauty industry is huge, it's growing throughout the 19th century, and there's these, well patronized fragrance houses. In the mainstream fashion periodical literature, fragrance is really not discussed as much as other forms of fashion consumption. And I found that really interesting. And of course, it's not that surprising. And when I started connecting the dots and thinking about things that I'd read that other people had already sort of talked about, but I hadn't really connected it with the advertisement issue, is that, cosmetics in general, throughout most of the 19th century, and particularly in the early 19th century, when naturalism and sort of these discourses in and around the natural body, and sort of what you see on the outside is like emblematic of what's on the inside, and this association between sort of the external representing the internal, there's this dislike of the notion of artifice, even though it is required to obtain a certain level of considering yourself to be attractive. You have to look good, you have to smell good, et cetera, et cetera. But in Victorian culture, it's sort of separated from the representation of fashion and femininity. And so it's there, it's practiced, but it's not talked about openly. except in certain select scenarios. And I found that really fascinating. I have come across many ads, and unfortunately I didn't get to actually putting in the proper citations here, but I can do that before it ends up getting posted somewhere. If you're curious at all, you can contact me, and I'm happy to let you know where I got these images, but I just didn't have them handy when I was trying to plop them into my presentation in like 5 seconds. And so one of the things that I've done as I've gone through is, even though fragrance is not my primary area of research, because I'm personally interested in it, every time I came across an advertisement, I would photograph it, because they were so rare to actually see them, being featured, compared to the sort of like, oh my God, the avalanche of ads about corsetry and about ways to keep your skirts tidy and different contraptions for controlling, and the importance of tailoring, and where to go to get this kind of hat, where to go to get that kind of dress. The body of advertisements around around clothing is everywhere, but fragrance and cosmetics is much more veiled, and it's difficult, and it's also veiled not just visually, it's veiled in all the discourses of the 19th century that have to do with othering and desire and like Orientalism, and the impetus towards looking back to the Greeks. If we want to talk about nudity, we have to veil it in mythology. We have to talk about these idealized sort of Platonic forms. We can't actually talk about the real body in the here and now. And so a lot of the visual culture in the 19th century around flowers, around scents, around the notion of your senses, a lot of these corporeal embodied aspects of fashion are veiled or translated in another form. And this is also true of fragrance advertising. And I find that fascinating. So just in that specific, I followed up the Guerlain thing because I have a lot of books on Guerlain. These are just some images that I've taken from various sources, and I apologize for the low quality of some of them. But so if you look at the way that Guerlain, and I could do probably a whole hour lecture on this because I'm so fascinated. If you look at the way that they have not just marketed their fragrances, but used sort of historical knowledge, research, tradition, but also this intense, long-lived ability to archive information, to keep it handy when you want to use it, to have the power to reify or to revive older bottle styles, to both change bottle styles and approaches and visual approaches to communicating fashion, while also drawing on history, the manipulation of the modern and taking the ancient, bringing the ancient into the modern, and taking the modern and making it historical. This kind of playing around with time and playing around with the discourses around art, for example, and that connection between art and fashion, and kind of playing upon that. And they continue to do this with and although I would not call it an inclusive practice, because many of their limited collections, which are developed out of formulas that are taken from the past, and they're painstakingly redone, they're in numbered bottles. They might reproduce like a special series. One in particular, which I eventually broke down and bought one of these, was this formulation of I believe it came out around the same time as L'Heure Bleue, which was 1912. And it was a fragrance called Fall Aromé. And they reproduced this fragrance for a very limited run. And you couldn't get a hold of it unless you knew somebody or you went to the Paris boutique. And it's numbered. And I mean, they treat it kind of like a work of art, and they are works of art. And so for people who are not really that familiar with the fragrance world, there is marketing, there is advertisement, and quite often it does kind of communicate the quality of the ingredients and the processes through which a fragrance is developed, but sometimes it doesn't. And that is a world that's very confusing for people. In the case of Guerlain, I think most of the time you are getting what you pay for to some extent, although I think the prices have been inflated pretty drastically over the past 20 years. However, this idea of history, but even Guerlain used the same approaches to marketing fragrance that many other companies did in the 19th century, which is to look to the past, to look to, what were considered foreign or exoticized locations, and then to draw on that to sort of create an atmosphere. Because how do you visually represent an olfactory experience? And that's part of the part of the why I'm so interested in visual culture of fragrance, because it is not a direct translation. It's not iconic or indexical in the way that other signs are, where you like, this is a dress, you see the silhouette. You can kind of make out what the construction is kind of based on what you're seeing. But with fragrance, you can't see what you smell. And that complexity I find fascinating. And so I find fragrance advertising and discourse, more than any other area, is more heavily overloaded and bogged down with whatever discourses and social and cultural assumptions or associations are going on at that particular time. And I suspect it's not just in British culture or in French culture. So one of the books that I came across in my travels is a reproduction. This is an original photograph from that I pulled off the internet. I have a reproduction, which was just reprinted, but it was this book by Eugene Rimmel, the Book of Perfumes from 1865. And Rimmel himself was involved in the fragrance industry. He was very interested in perfumes, interested in the history of perfume. And so he produced this book, and this is just a quote from the preface. He says, I published in the English Woman's Magazine a series of articles on the history of perfumery and the toilette. These few stray leaves having met with a much more favorable reception than I had presumed to anticipate, I have been induced to republish them in the shape of a book. Other than being sort of a little bit self-aggrandizing, it is true that I think that people are much more interested in that period. People were much more interested than they let on. And so when articles would come out, they would be, happily consumed. One of the images I came across in this text, and I had to pull it off the internet, so it's not great quality, but this is a representation of Venus at her toilette, right? And she's got all these putti floating around her, and they're bringing her cosmetics and her perfume. And this open display of dress practices that involve grooming, that involve direct contact with the body, in Victorian literature and visual culture was shrouded. So you did not see representations visually, unlike the 1930s and 40s, where you would see women sitting at their vanity and you would see them engaged in the act of beautifying themselves. By then, it had been naturalized, this idea of women beautifying themselves as being, in fact, an object of beauty in and of itself. That did not really happen in the 19th century for fashionably dressed present-day contemporary representations of women. So if you look throughout, Impressionist paintings, there are very few, if any, representations of women looking at themselves in the mirror, applying makeup, putting perfume on. Like it just doesn't happen, right? There's like women on the beach, women in a boat, women rocking a cradle, and like there's these domestic scenes, but getting ready, dressing oneself, touching oneself, looking at oneself, thinking about yourself, this was kind of considered inappropriate in the visual culture of the Victorians, but they were fascinated with it, of course. And so you see these representations of this care of the body, but it is translated through the mythologizing discourses of, classical mythology, take your pick, right? And so I just, I used to come across these images sometimes and I would be fascinated by them and I wouldn't know why. So when I was doing research on another totally unrelated topic, in the ladies' world, I came across this image. At the time, I was doing research looking at sort of genre images of women set in some distant ancient past wearing classical or Grecian dress. And I was sort of connecting that with artistic dress of the 19th century and trying to sort of figure out where this visual culture, how important was this visual culture? And of course, it's everywhere, as Robin will tell you, because we've talked about this many times. But in going back and looking at these images again and realizing how much of the fascination that Victorians and probably elsewhere as well, although I only came across this in Victorian periodicals because that's my area of study, that actually this interest in the body and in what the ancient Greeks were doing, what oils, what balms, what, mythology around, the Egyptians and Cleopatra and what was she wearing and how was she putting makeup on? I mean, the interest was expressed by pushing it into another area, another realm. And so a lot of these images of women dressed in classical dress, and there was an accompanying article that talked about women in classical culture. And it was sort of like an historical overview, but it kept touching on the present. Like, unlike today, and I remember content from this article, unlike today, where Victorian women tend to be more natural, the Greeks love to paint their faces and they're highly artificial. No. And then so we have, but the representation we have of this classical figure is that she's holding, obviously amphorae and urns and vases. They were used to hold a great variety of different things. But one of the things that they were often used to hold was to hold, liquids that would be associated with bathing or with oils. Smaller ones would have, unguents or whatever you call them. I pronounce them like oils and balms and these, and even medicinal oils that could be used that were fragrant and had, essential oil benefits, etc. But the floral imagery, which is just so everywhere in Victorian culture, now I'm starting to look at that floral imagery. It's not just a sign or sort of a marker of femininity. It's also a marker of this sense of smell. And so I think that if we kind of reorient ourselves to look at the way that floral imagery and the way flowers are represented in Victorian culture, I think it comes to stand in for a lot of obsessive kind of interest that people had in smells. And it's not surprising that people were fascinated with smells because of how awful a lot of areas in urban areas smelled in this period for a variety of reasons. But I'm starting to ramble. So am I out of time now, Veronica? I think I'm probably
You're close to time.
Okay, so I think I have one more slide. Yes, this is just my last slide. So one of my favorite artists is Marie Spartelli-Stillman. And I think I'm gonna go back and look through her stuff again and also consult with stuff published recently by other people on Spartelli-Stillman. But I think almost in almost every single one of her, solo representations of a female body, there is a theme of a particular type of, like a particular floral, like one flower, and roses are, I could talk on and on about rose imagery and how the rose was kind of positioned in Victorian literature. But I'm going to end there and open it up for questions. And hopefully, if anyone is still interested in talking more, they can reach out and get in touch with me. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Really thought-provoking. Lots of, I kept commenting, which I had to stop myself. I've also been Googling Ellen Terry and perfume and finding lots of wonderful stuff too. So thank you, Caroline, as well. You've made me think very differently about my research. But enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Anna. You might want to sort of put comments as well as questions to Kim, I think, as you go through, but I will leave that over to you.
Okay, so there are some interesting comments in the chat, and I think it's very clear that this discussion today is a bit of a kind of mind bender. It's starting to make us, well, not starting for many of us, we've been doing this for a long time, but we're looking at dress through the lens of fragrance, and that's a really kind of weird thing to do. Okay, so Jessica kicks off with that wonderful Guerlain discovery you make in the first slide, Kim. And Jessica makes the point that they're wearing Guerlain après l'onde right now. Now, I don't know what that smells like, but it sounds lovely. It sounds delightful. Are we all wearing fragrances to suit today's papers, I wonder? Veronica is thinking on the lines of Au Bonheur des Dames and the Ladies' Paradise, and thinking about the whole fragrancing of department stores. Clearly the Coty experiment has jumped in there, Veronica, and you're thinking of all the lovely smells there. And Hilary's saying, well, guess what? I'm using as a source for my talk. So we're going to hear a bit more about that later on. Ellen Terry and Veronica thinking about fragrance. Now, big question from Veronica. The connection between perfume and artifice is intriguing, particularly given the points that Caroline raised about natural versus synthetic ingredients and the evolution of the perfume industry in the late 19th, early 20th century. I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit more to do with this, Kim, if you've got any insights on natural and synthetic in the Victorian timeframe.
So much. I feel like other people are more equipped to talk about the actual ingredients of fragrance. I know quite a bit about contemporary debates on synthetics and how fragrance is composed, and the fact that, I could go at length on and on about the clean beauty industry and how a lot of clean ingredients are in fact, they're still allergenic. There's this kind of, even now in contemporary culture, we tend to polarize the idea of natural and artificial, and we tend to vilify the artificial, and the reverse is actually true, right? So in contemporary, and I don't know, people can feel free to debate with me about this because they probably have more experience than I do. But the artificial, in many cases, now is well tested and safe and a better alternative than a lot of natural essences. Because if you don't use essential oils in the proper way, and if you use too much of essential oils, and many of the restrictions, what people don't realize, a lot of the IRFA restrictions of contemporary perfume today are of natural essences. So for example, eugenol, which comes from rose oil, I believe, it is quite potent and can be considered dangerous at high levels. So one of the fragrances I love and have historically collected has been Nahima by Guerlain, which is a very, very powerful rose-scented, sweet, kind of honeyed rose fragrance that also has peach, sort of a peachy top note. And the Parfum version of that has been discontinued. And the reason for that is because they cannot produce it legally anymore, because it has too much of this natural thing, which is dangerous. And I like to use that as a way of trying to problematize this idea of artificial versus natural. And I'm not saying all natural essences are, can be toxic at high levels. I'm not saying that, but I do want to complicate this notion of artifice. And I think that even though when we look back in the past and look at the way the Victorians viewed artifice, it would be useful for us to not simplify that and just say, oh, they felt that artificiality was just bad. No, it was artifice in certain contexts. So I don't know if that actually answers the question, but I think it's a much more complex issue, both now and then, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Stephanie in the chat has said words to the same effect, that it's about perceptions of the good woman and artifice.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, have you come across in your researches any instances of women discussing the scents available to them? Now, I don't know what format this would be. We're always looking for that first-hand evidence, aren't we? And it may just not be there, but
and anyone, please put in the chat if you're aware of this. My understanding, I mean, remember, I'm a visual culture historian, right? And I feel like a lot of that material would be found in literary journals. I tended to stick mostly to fashion journals in my research, along with, and I didn't come across a lot of discussions in fashion journals about fragrance. I just did not. They just don't seem to be there. A lot of them are, and I obviously my knowledge is not comprehensive in any way, shape, or form. But whereas there's lots of debates in the literature about, for example, corsetry, and or how wearing clothing a certain way or a certain time of day. The stuff about what to wear, how to wear fragrance, where to get fragrance, these discussions, they just don't happen in a lot of Victorian periodicals. However, you find a lot of discussion, from my knowledge, you find a lot of discussion about the senses in literature. So a literary scholar would probably have a lot more information. Veronica, you probably come across more stuff because you've looked at a lot more literary sources. So I would think that those kinds of conversations might be happening in literary journals, but probably, again, veiled in the discourses of the literary world and narrative, rather than direct conversations about. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's
totally, yeah. And Julia has made the comment that they've been working with 1840s French fashion journals, particularly the Petit Courrier des Dames, where not visual representations, but praising the products in the text and where to get them. And this makes an interesting sort of, yeah, that's interesting. So Robin is talking about aestheticism, and the opening of Dorian Gray is the best for this. And Robin is very interested in your connections with the hygienic as well. And I often think about this. I mean, one of the primary reasons for fragrance at all is to mask the body, isn't it? Or is it? It's just something I always, please correct me if I'm wrong.
I think a lot of I just read this thing about Beau Brummel, and it's very interesting, actually. But I think that there is this idea that, yes, you can use fragrance to mask unpleasant smells, but I feel like the general consensus is that it's mostly used to ward off other people's smells. In the Victorian period, you've got the pomanders and the vinaigrettes, and like carrying around scented, having your scented handkerchief, having your gloves, putting your glove up to your nose, trying to stop yourself from smelling the city. I think it was still regarded as And I think there's a lot of cultural bias and assumptions too, like a lot of the assumptions that some cultures have about other cultures and how they wear fragrance and what's strange about that and what are they doing? They don't bathe, and or they bathe too much, or like these kinds of intercultural accusations of how their embodied practices are different and therefore bad. I feel like this is more about judging others rather than the actual functionality of like masking one's own smell, because the reality is that if you smell bad because you have not bathed for many, many, many days, putting a bunch of perfume on your body is not going to change that. It's just going to add a new flavor to how you already smell. And so I feel like, you know, this is one of those things that people debate about, but ultimately, and that's one of the reasons why I love fragrance, it is incredibly subjective. So what you think is a refreshing and clean smell, and I find this all the time whenever I go perfume shopping, because I'm not a person who loves citrus notes a lot. And people are always trying to give me these everyday scents. And I'm like, listen, the bracing slap in the face that is the citrus top note, if it's over the top, that is not an everyday pleasant smell for me, but that's subjective. That's my understanding. So I love the fact that scent is so subjective. And therefore, it's something that if you want to learn about others, you really have to be very open-minded. You know, it's not like the field of aesthetics where 200 years ago, there was like good art and bad art. Like you either knew what good was. I feel like that's never been an issue in fragrance. It's always been more inclusive than that. I mean, maybe not price wise.
I think that's it. Sorry, I'm going to jump in, Anna, just because of time, but because also I thought that was a lovely bridge to Hilary's paper, where we start to think about, again, as is coming through, how culturally subjective scents are, and also how connected they are with wider debates around Orientalism, global trade, etc. And thank you, Kim, for kind of initiating those thoughts. I am going to move straight into Hilary's paper because we'll try and keep vaguely to time today, but it is just so fascinating. So again, Hilary will not be unfamiliar to you, but I will briefly introduce her. So Hilary Davidson is chair of the MA Fashion and Textile Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology, New York, and an honorary associate at the University of Sydney. She was curator of fashion and decorative arts at the Museum of London and has lectured, broadcast and taught across a wide range of dress and textile history expertise. She definitely has. She's a consultant in archaeological textiles and for the Oxford English Dictionary, and is on the editorial board of Fashion Studies, which do check out, everyone, if you haven't already. Her extensive study of British Regency dress was published in The Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, and her, well, let's say not her next book, her current book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, has very recently been published with Yale and is justifiably doing very well and is wonderful. But today she is going to be talking to you about the fragrance of fabrics and directions in research. It's a very new area that she's venturing into, and she's very generously sharing this early stage research with us. So over to you, Hilary.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Veronica. And yes, this is sort of, these are not formed thoughts in the sense of emerging research that this forum allows. This is kind of things towards, and some observations that I want to sort of share more publicly in the hope that they trigger some new ways of looking for other people as well. So it will not surprise you that I'm starting off with a quote from Jane Austen. I mean, it feels inevitable these days, but this is the most one of the most famous discussions about materiality in Austen. The quote from the section in Northanger Abbey where Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland are talking with Mrs. Allen about muslins. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, but I just want to sort of focus on the section where he's talking about buying muslin and says, I gave but 5 shillings a yard for it, and a true Indian muslin. And there's a lot of debate about what is meant by a true Indian muslin at this point, because Austen sort of wrote Northanger Abbey in the late 1790s. She revised it in 1805, but it wasn't published until 1817, but it's very much not a novel of 1817. It reflects earlier periods and the competing roles of Indian and British muslin at that point. So I've thought a lot about what this true Indian muslin might be, but in the research for my first book, I came across this really fascinating section in a book from 1795. So, this is a picture here, of the top muslin here is British muslin, and the bottom muslin here is Indian muslin. And you can see the slight differences in the textures there as well. About the British muslin is slightly more regular, and the hand-woven Indian is more irregular. Oh, hang on. I seem to, nope. I've got my slides in the wrong order, which is always exciting. I'll flip back to it. So this reference that I found from 1795 is in a book called Valuable Secrets Concerning Arts and Trades. It's anonymous, but it was published in Norwich in Connecticut. And they're talking about, that they give instructions to how to fake Indian painted silks. And then they go on to give the above mentioned painted silks all the smell and fragrancy of the India ones. And so when you look at it, it says it is well known that the silks and other things we receive from India are all tainted with a certain particular smell and agreeable fragrancy, which being their peculiar, distinctive and most obvious character, if not imitated also, would help not a little in ruining the deception intended by the above labor. And so he goes on to sort of say exactly how you fake the smell of Indian textiles. You have a small closet or a basket, and then you put in cloves, whole pepper, mace, nutmeg, allspice, and etc., and put your works among these ingredients and keep it shut until you have received a full impression from the odor of those ingredients. So this kind of it blew my mind slightly, because I had never thought about true Indian muslins as having a smell that came from them. And the way he talks about it, it is well known that they're all tainted with this particular smell. And it got me thinking about what dimensions of this kind of ephemerality of textiles, the actual smell of textiles themselves, we might have lost, and the way that 19th century people are understanding textiles themselves. So to go back to this picture here, this is, although the East India Company completely undermines the Indian muslin industry throughout the early 19th century, it is still in operation by throughout the rest of the century. And this beautiful piece of muslin that is made in Dhaka for the export market in 1855, now when I look at this, I'm sort of going, well, does that smell like Indian textiles? And there's another reference that Ashmore found about a Bolton weaver who, as the British muslin is starting to come into ascendancy, he would ship his British muslins to India in order to have them shipped back to start to smell like Indian muslins. And so when I was sort of looking for other examples of this as well, I started to look to literature, as Kim says, and found this wonderful section from the beginning of North and South. So Cousin Edith is getting married, and her mother says, I've spared no expense in her trousseau. She has all the beautiful Indian shawls and scarf the general gave to me, but which I shall never wear again. So in the sort of the mid-1850s, this girl is having her mother's shawls and scarves given to her. So they've been around for a while. And the next section talks about how valuable these things still are. And then Margaret, our heroine, she goes up to the nursery to get the shawls down, and she comes down laden with the shawls, snuffing up their spicy Eastern smell. So again, there's this sense of kind of origin and perhaps also veracity, authenticity, being embodied in not just the materiality of the weave and the embroidery, but the smell too, and that they're so well steeped in the fragrance that even after many years, and presumably being kept packed as well, they've retained this scent. So this sort of got me thinking about other ways that fragrance, that the fabrics had their own fragrance. And we've heard a bit about perfumed gloves, and I'm interested in that kind of the application of perfume deliberately to things. So this is a record from Melusina Trench in 1820. Her son sent her French gloves, and she says, they're mysterious and forbidden. They are delicacy itself and have a peculiar and refined smell that I like much. And the application of perfume to objects is quite easy. But then I started to look again at this, anonymous valuable secrets. And there's little things like when they're talking about dyeing gloves, how to make skins and gloves take these dyes, they're actually grinding these dyes in with perfumed oil of jasmine or orange flowers. And then you soak it in orange flower water, so that some of this perfuming is not sort of applied as a secondary thing. It's part of the color, and that as you color, you also fragrance. And to go sort of, because obviously Regency, the sort of the period I've been focused on. So I found, I was looking at this 1815 example of an encyclopedia of domestic economy, and there's lots of discussion about essential oils and essences. So they're talking about attar of roses here. The smallest drop on a pair of gloves will perfume them for a long time. So again, this is kind of an externalized edition of perfume. But then this kind of list of how you perfume sort of finished garments by contact. And so we have the tonka bean here that Caroline introduced us to. In West Indies in America, it's employed to put it among clothes and keep away moths. A list of perfumed spirits, some of which are used for perfuming wearing apparel, such as handkerchiefs, shawls, etc. Others are partly remedial, so we're looking again at that hygienic aspect. Essence of rondatella, specifically for perfuming handkerchiefs, and then sachet powders, exactly where you put them among linen, articles of dress in wardrobes or drawer, into bags of taffeta, lay them among the wearing apparel. And this is also to give a perfume and to drive away moths. So again, there's like a multiplicity of purposes for this. And it does very much seem to be sort of, as Kim said, preventative. People are they're not necessarily taking baths, but they're washing every day and putting on clean linen. And to have the linen itself kind of perfumed, or your muslin smelling of lavender, which is another reference from North and South, also kind of enhances that. But then I was thinking as well about what other fabrics themselves might smell like. And I think a lot of our discussion about the fragrance of fabric has been sort of framed in, the sort of the smell of old clothes, and our experience of historic 19th century objects in museums is kind of, conditioned by the smell that old clothes sort of have from being stored, or just from time or age. But what did they smell like at the time? So I did go to the Ladies' Paradise, and there's lots of mentions there of kind of things being perfumed and fragranced. But I really liked this reference, which is talking about the heroine Denise's uncle has a tailoring shop, and it's presented as a contrast to this new fantastic department store. And it says, bales of dark merchandise were piled up to the beams. The smell of cloth and dyes, an acrid chemical smell, seemed to be intensified by the damp of the floor. So that's also got me thinking about things like this. So, this beautiful picture of Paris street on a rainy day, 1877. What is it that damp air is releasing from clothes? What are the outer clothes, the tailored jacket, the waistcoat, what are they smelling like from these dyes and from the treatments about cleaning them and getting the color in? How is that mixing in with the smells of the city, and even more closely indoors, as these kind of that dampness releases inherent fragrances in the textiles? And I'm very glad that we've come up with the synthetic dye discussion as well, because most famously William Perkin, who I didn't realize that he invented synthetic tonking in 1868, because he's most famous for discovering synthetic aniline in 1856. But again, this kind of thinking about what the fragrance of fabrics themselves is, I've started to wonder what these aniline dyes smell like. Did they impart to the silks that they're dyeing a certain particular chemical smell? Would people be able to, in a kind of their haptic understanding of textiles, smell that something was synthetic, even if they couldn't see it? So I've sort of thinking as well about Alison Matthews David's book on fashion victims, and all of the kind of the poisons and chemicals she discusses there. What was their olfactory impact on clothing? And the all of the processes that go into highly manufactured fabrics, especially crepe, which requires quite a lot of fabric torture. There's this sort of great line here I found in a couple of references: shall we muffle ourselves in black funeral smelling crepe and sing doleful hymns? So what is it that these processes give to crepe that make it smell a particular way? And is there an association with mourning and with smelling from there? So just to sort of end off, because this is quite a quick talk, I also found more references from right at the end of the century, 1899, that kind of link the beginning and the end. And this is a monograph on dyes and dyeing in the northwestern provinces of India. And there's still this kind of concept of using perfumed dyes. So licorice is employed in calico printing to perfume the fabric and give it a finish. Kapur Katri is also used to preserve the clothes from attacks of insects, but the roots are often used as an auxiliary in dyeing to impart a pleasant smell to the fabric. Chaurila is used in calico printing to perfume the cloth and to give a rose tinge. So the notion of dye and scent are seeming to be very, very linked in Indian textile production. And if we look at the kind of the ingredients for Malagiri, many of these are fragranced as well. So clove, cardamom, sandalwood, saffron, musk, lime. And this dyeing manual as well talks about 3 shades of brown, in the production of which scents play a more important part than dyes proper. Cloths dyes in these shades are admired greatly for their sweet smell and are used chiefly for lining night coverings. And so I'm going to end there, but I just wanted to sort of present all these things as different ways into thinking about how fabric smelled and why fabric smelled, and the fabric itself, not just kind of what was perfumed on top of it. So I'm going to leave it there and hope that this inspires people to share other things or think differently about 19th century fabrics. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. I think definitely, judging by what the conversations that have been popping into the chat, everyone is starting to think with their olfactory senses after today's papers. It's amazing, even looking at the pictures differently now, we are changing our minds in a good way. But I'm going to let Anna take over and get some questions to you.
There are lots and lots of comments here, Hilary, and they're coming thick and fast. I mean, it really made us think about dye stuffs being linked with fragrance, and I think that's fascinating. Okay, so Veronica kicks off with loving the title "Valuable Secrets" and the fact it was anonymous. So it's a sort of insider's insight in. That
comes from the Renaissance. You see this in kind of books of secrets. These were seen as like trade secrets, and it's kind of part of an ongoing tradition that is also linked in with lots of Renaissance apothecary and cosmetics and perfuming.
Yeah, and that you're getting access to something really authentic. This is the way to do stuff. I was wondering, as you were talking about the fragrances for perfuming muslins for the export market, do you think there were notions of preconceptions of what the Western market was expecting and fulfilling it? Maybe that's an impossible thing to answer, but is there a set of smells that conjure India?
As far as I understand it, a lot of it has to do with just the mechanics of shipping, because they're also shipping all of these spices. So that the kind of all of the cinnamon and the cloves and the cardamom, and the tea is in the hull of the ship. And so when you have kind of wooden crates that things are packed in, or if they're just wrapped in oiled cloth, the scent is actually in a multi-month journey from India. It's kind of just packed in there, and then they kind of absorb it from that. I mean, there may also have been some production of that in India, but I think it's kind of the kind of things they shipped from India were scented, and that the muslin kind of takes that on in the hold of the ship.
Interesting. And Veronica is saying that she's imagining a library of smells and associations in the 19th century mind that we can only sort of imagine, really. What, for instance, might the interior of Liberties have smelt like, or morning crepe, but there's more about morning in the chat later on. A lot of thinking to do. I make the point about fragrance and the leather dyeing process. It goes back to what Caroline was saying about the habitual use of ammonia. Is that right, Caroline? Was it ammonia? Something from urine and something from feces, which obviously smell appalling.
Yeah, it's mainly from urine. It's the ammonia compounds used to break down the leather. I'm not sure about feces.
They used to the Purers, they used to collect dog excrement from the street and sell it to the tanneries. This was like a way of making money for the poor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chris, moving swiftly on from that one, Chris has made the point that, to give another non-European example, the Japanese, particularly in the Heian period, were noted for perfuming garments in a seasonal way, usually with a brazier. The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon and the Tale of Genji are full of references to the practice. So there's a whole world of smells out there which are awaiting us. Veronica points out that she's heard about plantings next to paths in some gardens, which were intended to brush against wide skirts, which I think is an amazing idea. I want a garden that does that. Kay is talking about, going back to the 1960s when there was a big switch to synthetic fabrics, and the acrid smell was quite noticeable when you walked in. It was even eye burning, so you could the clothes were still giving off. I mean, certainly I've noticed that when I looked at paper clothing in Worthing Archive, and the dyes they used were all embedded with anti-inflammables, and they stank.
I can't walk past some shoe stores now because it's all synthetic materials, and I can tell, like, with my eyes closed, what kind of shoe store it is based on the smell of whether it's, leather or whether it's just this kind of overwhelming synthetics of
plastics.
Yeah.
Plastic smell. Chris is saying that there were comments from wearers about the unpleasant smell of morning crepe. So
thank you, Chris. I should know you'd know about that.
Yeah, good point. I mean, that would add to the unpleasantness of the whole morning process as well. You're suddenly putting on these clothes that smell really bad. Julia has read of a note in aristocratic women's letters from the 1830s where one sister wrote to the other that her shawl still reeked of bleach, which is a very unsisterly thing to say. I read in something, and I think it was Zenna at Darkness, where a child woke up to smell a dye bath on the stove, and that's how they knew there'd been a death in the family. They would smell the black dye bubbling away on the stove, getting ready, because everything had to be thrown in, to get you ready. Lots of thank you. That was fascinating and provoking. Jane had said that even now South Asian block printed textiles smell of spices and fragrance. And so this is Jane speaking, I always assumed it was to do with what they were transported with, but to know the dye and the fragrance were intrinsically linked is truly fascinating. Sonia's saying, it's interesting that you mentioned the sense of the city infusing the fabric. And Sonia would be interested to research into peasant and working class people's clothing and how environments would have infused their clothing. Good point, Pat. Doesn't everyone take a sniff of antique textiles when they are examining them? Well, we've all been taught to do that, haven't we, with the material culture approach. Prown says do it, doesn't he? He says scratch and sniff. Having worked in the fashion and textile department of an auction house, I can confirm. Oh, I've lost my place. Oh, there's so many comments. They're coming up so fast now. Okay. One of my colleagues called the centre of the 20th century fashion sectors eau de vie femme. Okay. It was really stale Chanel number 5. Now, Kimberly is talking about poo. She says civet can smell a bit fecal. And that's a thing, isn't it, Caroline, in perfuming? Isn't there something that smells of poo?
Yes. So civet is an excretion from next to the anal glands of a cat, a wild cat, but in some fragrance, in some flowers, There's a raw material called indole, and indole is also naturally found in feces, and that's why sometimes jasmine can smell a bit pooey. Some people can be more sensitive to it than others. I am very, very sensitive to it, hate all jasmine smells. But then, yeah, most white flowers will have an element of indole in some manner or other inside it, and that's naturally just to attract kind of wildlife actually in the flowers. But yeah, indole is found naturally in other locations.
And it's an ingredient in fragrance.
Yes.
Is that not mind-blowing?
For us, definitely, I would say. I mean, this whole, I know I want to carry on talking, but I'm also aware that we've run slightly over time. We can carry on chatting, but in case anyone needs to leave, I think we should thank all our speakers and start to round things up. And anyone else who wants to carry on talking, please, we'll be around for at least another sort of 5-10 minutes potentially. But before we do round up, Anna, I'm kind of jumping in on your role here, but I noticed that Margaret Mooney put in the chat, odor is one of the things I note on a condition report when I presume cataloguing things in museum stores, and people have often asked me about what textiles and dress smell like in museums. I've been aware of that and that kind of side of it, but not thought about the original smells, which Hilary and Caroline and Kim have helped us think about today. And I do hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have, because it really has changed the way I'm looking at and thinking about all aspects of 19th century dress and textiles. And thank you to our speakers and to Anna for stepping up as question master as well, and for all the team for helping to organise today's session. We do hope that you will continue to join us throughout the year. Our next one will be in October, towards the end of the month. I think it's not quite on Halloween, but we're very close to the Halloween weekend. We are finalising our theme for that one. It may have a political focus, it depends on finalising our speakers, but either way there will be another session in October, and you are all very welcome to join us. We're always keen to see anyone engaging with us, whatever their connection with dress or textiles is, or even if it's just a general interest. And if you do have ideas you want to share with us, please do get in touch to posit a paper, because it doesn't have to be finished, it doesn't have to be polished. We are keen to sort of hear research in progress, and as Caroline very bravely demonstrated today, I hope she didn't feel like she had to be too brave, but I know it's weird stepping into a new arena. You don't have to be this sort of dress or textile historian to be speaking to this audience. We want to bring these cross-fertilizations to the table. So thank you so much to all our speakers today, and to you all for joining us. I sound like a TV host, don't I? We really hope that, you go away thinking and sniffing as you wander through the rest of your day, evening, afternoon, morning, whatever happens to be the time with you. And like I said, we'll be back in October and look forward to seeing you then.